Layli is the CEO and founder of the Tahirih Justice Center, which is a nonprofit organization which helps women who are victims of rape and abuse. And she is a super cool activist, awesome person, and I've known her for a really long time. And she will be touching on the Black Lives Matter movement as well as the equality of men and women. So it's going to be a really interesting talk. And a lot of you guys have probably seen the slides that Lexi made for this. And so if you guys are wondering ways that you can help, you guys can go look at like the Instagram or the Skype. Lexi made a very amazing slideshow for it. So yeah, without further ado, we'll hear what Layli has to say.
Thank you, Jada, for inviting me to be with you guys. I'm looking forward to our conversation. My hope is that it is a conversation. I can share some things that Jada's asked me to share, but would want to hear your questions, your thoughts, your ideas. Actually, can I see the chat if people put stuff in chat? Is it?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay, because I would actually love to go ahead and get to know you guys. It's not so big of a group that we can't do that. So I don't know, in the chat, would you guys mind just saying what your age is, where you are, and what this is meant to be about career, right? Jada, kind of ideas about the future. And if anybody has an idea of their future, it's okay if you don't, but if you do, could you indicate that? So in the chat, so I can get to know you a little bit and maybe be more responsive as well to your interests. Wait, where's the, oh, okay, hold on. I can see the chat now. Actually, okay, there we go. Okay. So keep going ahead and putting your thoughts up there. So as Jada mentioned, I am a lawyer. I work in the area of human rights, civil rights. I'm the CEO of the Tahirih Justice Center, and what we do is we provide free legal defense for immigrant and refugee women and girls who are fleeing human rights abuses. So clients face things like female genital mutilation, child marriage, human trafficking, domestic violence, and other kinds of expressions of inequality of women and men. All of our clients also face intersectionally expressions of racism. All of our clients, not all, like 98% of our clients are Black and brown people. And so the system they enter into is stacked against them. And what they suffer also has a lot to do with racism. Actually, I think I'm going to be a little bit all over the place today, and I think it's because my brain is truly all over the place right now. But I want to just pause on the justice system for a second, because it'll help contextualize and help explain my work in it a little bit more. The justice system, you know, I think you all are in school, you're super smart, you've been learning a lot, you've been reading a lot, but I hope that you know that you're also being a little bit lied to. History books and books that are chosen by people in power. And so what you see is what you're allowed to see, and what school boards have chosen is most important for you. But it's not everything, and it's not an accurate history, for example, of the oppression of Black and brown people in the United States. It's not an adequate or an accurate impression of what happened to Indigenous people in the United States. So there's a lot that is really unknown, and you're going to have to go out on your own, unfortunately. I wish that wasn't the case, but you're going to have to go out on your own to get other learning and other reading. But because of the way the system is stacked, and because of who is making the decisions about how history has been told, a lot of people really, particularly in this moment when Black Lives Matter, and anger and learning and eagerness and all of these emotions that everyone is facing right now is so apparent. For some, it's confusing. For some, it's confusing because they don't know the history. and they don't know the reality. Even my 8-year-old son the other day, we were watching the news and we were talking about what's happening. And he said, I thought racism ended with Martin Luther King. And he had this sense from what he was taught in school that there's like slavery and then that ended and we didn't have to worry at all about that anymore. And then there was some bad stuff that happened, but Martin Luther King solved it all. And there's kind of, in many of the history books in school, there's a hurrah moment with Martin Luther King, and then not a lot is taught after him. And so there's a lot of remedial work that you all have to do on your own, unfortunately, in order to get that learning. But what I will share with you is a brief history of our justice system, which explains also the work that I do. But our justice system was unapologetically, transparently premised on white supremacy. So it's not even a conspiracy theory. It's just actual fact, overtly stated in the documents, transparently articulated. The whole justice system was taken, first of all, from the British. The British justice system was about maintaining the power of the land owners. And landowners could only be white and could only be men. So there's a design from the beginning around protecting wealthy, protecting white, protecting men. So we adopted that, we inherited that. And the whole justice system and the way it's designed is not actually about justice, and it never, ever has been. It's about winning. So it's all about winning, but not necessarily about truth or justice. And just to give you a really concrete example of that is a judge, when he or she is hearing a trial, sits on a big bench wearing black, looking very intimidating, and can't ask questions. The judge is prohibited from seeking the truth. So the judge has to rely on what the attorneys on either side are able to bring up from their witnesses. And if they fail, if they miss a point, if they don't adequately ask questions or interrogate somebody or defend, that kind of thing, then the client loses. And even if the judge suspects they're not hearing everything, there's nothing they can do about it procedurally. So whether or not you win is entirely dependent on how good your lawyer is. And that is entirely dependent on how much money you have. And so that's the whole design. And it's like, there's nothing apologetic about that. It's just completely set up that way. And so it will always be unjust. The US justice system will always be unjust because it was designed that way, until we completely reframe it. And it has to be even more than about fixing some laws here, fixing some laws there, doing some gender and race diversity training with judges. It's got to be way more than that, because we have this.
What? No, I'm not on camera.
Oh, we can hear you. I don't know who that was. Okay, so this is the justice system. When I was in high school, I had an amazing opportunity to engage on issues of race. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and when I was in high school, there was an incident at my school where a white girl and a black guy dated. I don't really know why they broke up, but they broke up. And then something happened, somebody got offended, and white people amassed and threatened to fight with the black guy after school. And then he happened to have transferred from another school. He called all his friends who happened to be black. And so then we had a race riot. Like, it became this horrible, horrible thing. And it made the news. It was super embarrassing to the principal. And so I talked to the principal and basically said, you have a problem that I want to help solve. And the problem is racism. And he had a PR issue on his hands because it made the school look really bad. And I was dancing at the time. I'm not a dancer in any way. And Jada, I say this to you with complete humility because I'm not real. Never was a real dancer. But I was like a wannabe hip hop kind of dancer who danced with this group called the Baha'i Youth Workshop. And the Baha'i faith is my religious tradition. Also, I know Jada's. But it was basically a dance group of young people who were trying to address social issues through the arts. And so what we did was the principal was just like, yes, anything, totally eager and open to ideas. And we came in and danced 4 different times. They rotated the whole school. And the dances were about racism and equality of women and men, that kind of thing. These were back in the Michael Jackson days, so that was the vibe. And we did this. Then in the library, we had discussions, kind of anti-racism and awareness discussions with all the high school students. So it was powerful. It didn't solve anything. Like it didn't, make everyone perfectly anti-racist or fix it, but it helped. It also gave me a personal experience about trying something, having a conversation with someone in power that I was scared to have, and it going somewhere and something actually happening. So it was my first like toe dip into activism. After that experience, I then worked for the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta. And there, my job, I was called a nonviolent student coordinator. And so my job was to read all of Martin Luther King's writings to really understand his theory of change, and then to work with young people as they were fighting for different injustices to try to involve his philosophy. Mrs. King started this initiative, and she was upset actually that people were using and misusing Martin Luther King. So just to give you one example of something that bothered her, was Martin Luther King has 7 steps for opposing injustice. It's a 7-step, actually it's a 6 or 7-step process. The second to the last step is protest. That's the second to the last step. There are all these steps beforehand that have to do with dialogue and engagement and awareness, and there are all these steps. Then there's protest, which is like last resort, then there is a step after protest, which is reconciliation. So, Martin Luther King was all about love. He was rooted in spirituality. He was rooted in the church, and he was rooted in a deep sense of forgiveness and a deep, deep sense of unconditional love. And so she was worried that people were missing the point. And so, so we were trying to do really hard work that I don't think we ever did satisfactorily, actually, to try to recalibrate people on what Martin Luther King really meant, what he really stood for, and what he really did in trying to create social change, which was not just about the protest or the sit-in part, but was also about education, awareness, truth telling, truth hearing, and then, yes, standing up to injustice, but then also then fixing it, and importantly, reconciling the relationships, so that there isn't stagnant resentment or stagnant hate, but that is gone full circle so that we can ultimately achieve unity. In the Baha'i writings, there's a quotation that says, "The purpose of justice is the appearance of unity." And I think Martin Luther King had the same philosophy, which is that justice isn't actually just about punishment. Punishment can be a part of it, but it's only like a part of it. The real arc of justice doesn't end, it doesn't stop until we reach the point of unity and the point of oneness. And it's a step in the process. And as we get to justice, it's not going to feel like unity. It's not going to feel like oneness, because there's a lot of yucky stuff that has to happen. There has to be truth, and the truth is hard to hear. It's hard to receive. It takes a lot of courage to speak out. Then there has to be some understanding of that truth. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to absorb it, really understand it. Then once the truth has been spoken, there has to be a decision, and there has to be a consequence. And this is the normal justice process. That's also really messy, and it hurts. And then there's a decision, a punishment, then that has to be implemented. That's like a whole separate process. Under the law, you can have a decision, but then it can take years to implement. All of that has to happen, and all of it feels uncomfortable, and all of it is challenging. And then there's this kind of relief. There's a sigh of relief when there's justice that allows for love to enter, and allows for reconciliation, and allows for oneness. And that's that whole arc, that whole process of justice. So having that experience in high school attracted me, and then working at the Martin Luther King Center attracted me to caring about issues of human rights, civil rights. I then had a professor in college who suggested law school. I had a prejudice against lawyers. I didn't have a particular, like I saw more harm that they did than good. I saw them more as working for corporations than I did working for the people. So I had my own limitations around how I viewed lawyers. What I did think would be useful, though, was to get a law degree so that I could understand the laws that I was trying to advocate for as a human rights worker. So I never really intended to actually go to law school. But then what happened was when I went to law school, I had the honor of representing a young woman who was 17 years old, and she was going to be subject to female genital mutilation or female genital cutting. She was also going to be forced into a forced marriage as a 17-year-old. She was going to have to be the fourth wife of a 45-year-old man. Oh, sorry. And Serena, thank you for giving my attention to the chat. I'm trying to look at y'all and I haven't looked at the chat. So British common law or civil law or criminal law? So British is common law. We adopted elements of it, but US laws evolved basically from British common law, and American law is civil law. So that's a great, very sophisticated question. But that's, oh, sure, Matt, do you want to clarify your question?
Yeah, sorry, if I could just clarify for 1 second.
Yeah.
So what I was understanding you were saying is that the American law system is more or less taken from British common law. But when you were talking about reforms, were those civil law reforms or criminal law reforms or both?
Yeah, both, everything. So, over the last 200 plus years, we have been trying to put additions onto the building that was built. So, there's this British legal system that we adopted, right? And we evolved it, we changed it. And even today, you can see some differences. But it was built on top of the British foundation that was laid. And then as we have struggled as a society to recognize its deficiencies over time, it's almost like a building that we have put additions onto. We've put a new wing on the Justice building. We saw that the plumbing was kind of old, so we replaced the plumbing. We've been doing different things to that building of justice in order to try to fix it up, make it more modern, make it welcome everyone, make it fit everyone. Like, there have been all these things that have happened to that house of justice over time to try to improve it. I no longer think that's possible, to be honest. And I've been in the business of creating those additions. That's been my job for the last, 25 years. But there is only so much spackle and paint you can put over a crumbling building's cracks. And that's what's happening to our justice system. And it's okay. Like, it's really okay for us to not use something exactly it was originally designed 200 years ago, when it had an overt racist intention. It's really okay to move from that, to move away from that, and to kind of rebuild something that's very different, that's very inclusive and very new. There are some things about the US justice system that have worked. And like I said, people like me and other human rights people have been working real hard. I mean, we've spent our whole career trying to do new plumbing and new additions and new paint and new spackle. And that's all to say that work is valuable, but it's insufficient. It's not really going to fix things at their root in a systemic way that need to happen. So let me see, could we get a definition of justice? I think one definition of justice is a world in which everyone feels safe and equitably treated. That would probably be the most important definition of justice. And then illegal in some states, female genital mutilation, forced marriage. So female genital mutilation is a federal crime. There was a law passed over 20 years ago that made it a crime, but there has only been one attempted prosecution under it in 20 years. And part of the reason for that, I think Americans in particular go very quickly to the law as the solution for everything. And I think part of it is because it's like easy. You can see a law, you can check off a box, you know, good, we have a law against racism. Now we're going to end racism. You know, we have a law now against domestic violence. We're going to end domestic violence. I think it's a natural inclination where we think, oh, the law will help. And don't get me wrong, I am a lawyer. I like the law. I use the law every day, but it's insufficient because we have to make sure that people's hearts are transformed. Our culture is changed, our attitudes, our values. Because when it comes to how we treat each other behind closed doors and in private spaces, legislation is very limited in being able to reach that. And so there's really a heart and soul transformation that has to happen in order for there to be true justice in the world. Now, forced marriage is not illegal, actually. So there is an effort, and I would recommend you all can look on the Tahirih Justice Center's website. Actually, if you Google Tahirih Justice Center and then forced in child marriage, if you Google that, what you'll get is actually a standalone website that we have that's entirely devoted to child marriage and forced marriage. That will lay out for you the very complex reality of the lack of law in the United States to protect people against forced and child marriage. But again, those are just symptoms of women not having power and girls often not being able to choose who they marry. So I think to the degree to which any of you have passion around helping to address any of these issues, I would encourage you, even as you look to change.org petitions and legislative advocacy and legal advocacy, also look to spiritual change, values change, behavioral change, because one is ineffective without the other. Let's see, there's some great questions. Let me try to catch up. What steps do you think we can take to significantly reform our judicial system? I think that's a great question. There are a lot of people who are smarter than I that have developed blueprints and very comprehensive ways to reform it, and often on different issues. So, for example, reading The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander will give you a very deep sense of what criminal justice reform could look like that would be more equitable and helpful. And then there are many others. But what I would say, so there's the detailed blueprint kind of answer, and then there's a higher principled answer. On the principled answer, a new justice system would have to be about justice and truth, not about winning in a way that's dependent entirely on money. So that piece of it, which is that bedrock, it's the foundation, it's absolutely the concrete on which this building of justice that we have in the United States right now was formed. It's this idea of winning, and you know, only in extreme criminal situations will you get appointed a lawyer. And in those situations, even those lawyers aren't great. There's a whole problem with that. But until there's equitable access to truth telling, and that it is about truth, not only whether you win or not, we won't have true reform in our justice system. So let me just try to catch up. Let's see. So I don't know, all states, I'm not sure. Well, the female gemulation law is a federal law that applies to all states. Child and forced marriage is a matter of family law, and family law is state by state by state. So right now, 5 years ago, there were 0 states that had any laws against child and forced marriage. Now, I'm proud to say that there are 19 states that have laws against forced and child marriage, but there are still over half the states that don't. And then let's see. Okay, so some of you are helping to answer, Matt, that's fine. And then the difference maybe between equitable and equal, that's a great question. It's worth saying. So equal is like same, okay? So being treated exactly the same would be treated equally. being treated equitably is fair, and it's not necessarily the same. So, you know, if we were running a race and the race started and everyone is running, but I, because of my gender, have been held back. Somebody grabbed my arm and said, this race isn't for you. You're not really qualified. You don't really count. And, or because of race, and said that. And then held that person back in the United States for 400 years. And then all of a sudden released and said, oh, okay, now you can run. You can run like everybody else. But the problem is everybody else is 400 years ahead. And so a really good example of this concretely in the context of race is to understand redlining. So in the United States, from about the 1920s up until the 1960s, there was a very strategic and intentional process to exclude African American families from receiving loans and from living in certain neighborhoods. It's called redlining. And if you Google it, there's some really great kind of mini videos with graphics that really help to explain what happened. But what it did was it prohibited Black families from having intergenerational wealth. So so my college education, I can tell you right now, was paid for because my parents had a mortgage. And the reason my parents had a mortgage was because their parents had a mortgage and they were able to own a house and they were able to use it for collateral and they were able to take it out for equity to start their business. My grandmother had this little knitting business. And you can go back and see the built up wealth that then allowed me to go to law school. And so what would be equitable, like what would be equal, would be to say everyone fend for themselves. We don't care what advantage you had, how much time you had, lead time out of the start gate you had. Equitable is we're gonna remedy the wrong. Equitable is to say we're gonna fix the hundreds of years of being held back that you and your family had, that you're living with right now. And we're gonna fix that and make things a little bit more equitable. There's money, like the loans, that's one area of equity. Another area of equity that's just now being able to be understood, but it's super interesting, and I highly recommend you all read into it, is epigenetics. So epigenetics, sorry. What this means is that our genetic makeup is impacted by the trauma of our ancestors. Diseases we hold, we inherit because of the trauma of our ancestors. Interestingly, so there's a book that was written in the 90s called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And I highly recommend you read it because it deals with kind of the after effects generationally of slavery. And remember, we had slavery for 400 years. We've only not had slavery for a little over 200 years. So you can only imagine the time it took to create all that. It's going to take at least as much time to undo it. But what the book does is it really lays out these lasting impacts in a way that's helpful. Then it was only until the Jewish community, and I have ethnic Jewish heritage, so I own this myself. But the Jewish community began to do genetic research on the impact of the Holocaust on generations of Jews. And what it found was that there were diseases, there were psychiatric disorders, there was all kind of impact, real impact on that trauma, which happened in a moment in time, but very significant, obviously. So what would be equitable would be to deal with that and to be fair. And for me as a white person to say, okay, I didn't do it, but my people did. And so I inherited the privilege that came from what my people did. I inherited the advantage for what my people did. And so I inherit the responsibility. I don't have to feel guilty about it. I don't have to feel bad about it. I just have to own it and know that responsibility to also rectify the systems that were set up for my advantage, and then the ways that I benefited from it. So let's see. And forgive me for maybe missing important thoughts. I'm going to try to skim. There is a great comic that explains it. Maybe, are you thinking of the one with the kids trying to look over the fence? Yeah, feel free to cut and paste that here. That is a great graphic that helps explain the difference between equitable and equal. Yeah. Let's see. So how did you start the Tahirih Justice Center? So the way the Tahirih Justice Center got started is that I had no, you know what? I'm going to stay on equity for a minute. I'll come back. I'll come back to your question. But Matt, I see you're struggling with that concept, and I want to address that because that's really important. So how do you remedy a wrong in a way that doesn't disadvantage other people? So, you know, first of all, I don't believe that we live in a world of zero-sum game. I also live in a world where I feel joy for your success and I feel pain for your failure. We are interconnected. And science bears this out. The coronavirus is a great example. You know, the health of others matters to our health. The economic well-being of others matters to our own economic well-being. So I don't see it as like somebody gets and then I lose, or somehow one person doing well means I do less well. I really think that we're all in it together, and it's entirely possible for everyone to advantage and to everyone to have benefits in ways that don't then disadvantage anyone else. However, it's also true that if I'm running a race, so let's go back to like the running the race example. If I'm running a race and I am so far in the lead, I've gotten real comfortable with that lead. I am used to being in the lead. I've got lots of space. I've got lots of room. I'm not anxious. I'm not worried. Nobody's coming up behind me. I am so used to that, being in the lead in the race, that when you start to come up behind me, I'm going to feel bad. I might feel a little anxiety. I might feel a little competition. I might feel like, ooh, this is less easy than it was, and so it's less good for me. It's not true, because when they're coming up behind me, it means I have to be stronger, faster, and better. And it's a gift, actually, in order to grow and to build. But it may feel that way. And I think what's happening, and you know, when you look at some rhetoric right now, there is fear, and there is some of that feeling of people are coming up behind me who I'm used to being way back there, and I'm more comfortable with them being way, way back there. And so that's true. That's a psychological fact that's true, but it doesn't mean disadvantage, but it might mean discomfort. And that's got to be okay. So let's see. Okay, so how the Tahirih Justice Center got started. The woman that I mentioned to you that I represented while in law school, and there is a whole book about that experience. I'm not going to go into great detail, but the book is called Do They Hear You When You Cry? So if you want the detail of my experience representing her as a law student and her experience in the United States, which was horrendous. She was kept in immigration detention and maximum security prison, even though she was 17 and had committed no crime, had done nothing wrong, but immigration contracts with maximum security prison facilities. So she was kept there. You can read her story, you can read all of the experience, but what happened was that her case climbed to the highest immigration appellate court, and there she won. And her case then changed the law in the United States. Before her case, it wasn't possible to receive asylum or refugee status because of female genital mutilation, or for that matter, any other form of gender-based persecution. The law had not recognized gender-based harm as a grounds for asylum until her case. Because it set precedent, it was very controversial. It was in the press a lot. And because it was in the press, there was commercial interest in her story. And so I wrote a book along with her that was purchased, and I used all of my portion of the proceeds of the book to start the Tahirih Justice Center. And at first, when I first graduated from law school, I worked for the Justice Department for a small period of time while I was trying to get Tahirih up and running. And then I thought I would go and work full-time at Tahirih, but I was told by wiser people, mentors in my life, that I didn't know what I was doing. And they were absolutely right. I was too young. I didn't know how to be a lawyer yet. Not really. I didn't know how to manage people. I didn't know how to run an organization, anything that's pretty important to successfully run a nonprofit organization. So I hung back for the first 6 years of Tahirih's existence. During that time, I worked for a corporate firm. It's a very large corporate firm in DC, and they let me do a lot of pro bono work, which means that I donated my time as a lawyer to represent people who couldn't afford a lawyer. And I was blessed to work for a law firm that had a really great pro bono policy. And by the time I left the law firm, I was doing half of all my work on a pro bono basis. So I used millions of dollars of the firm's money in order to represent people who needed it. And then the Tahirih Justice Center, now I'm at Tahirih full-time, continuing that work. And we have over 100 full-time staff. We are in 5 offices around the country, DC, Houston, San Francisco, Atlanta, and Baltimore. We're litigating around 2,000 cases at any one moment in time. And obviously current times have made our work even more difficult, but it's even more important. So let's see, I'm going to turn back to the questions now and continue to send them. Let's see. So maybe, Matt, do you want to, I'm not sure I understand your comment. Do you want to share what you mean?
Yeah, I totally get the theory of how you would want to go about, basically righting the wrongs of the past, but I'm kind of curious as to how this happens in practice. So like one way I've seen proposed is lower interest rates for business loans for businesses run by, minorities. But I would say, wouldn't that harm businesses not run by minorities, because it would make it easier for minority-run businesses to get capital and start producing a product? So wouldn't that harm non-minority-run businesses? Or
no, thank you for the question. That's an important question. I think the same question you have also comes up in the context of college admissions. Some of you may have followed that there was a lawsuit around college admission as well. So this is where it's important to understand privilege and what privilege means. So in the context, it's true for loans, and I'll come back to the loan example, but it's also very true in college admissions. So some of you may know that there was a lawsuit brought a couple of years ago against Harvard Law, and it had to do with the issue of perceived discrimination. What was brilliant about the lawsuit was the truth came out. All the actual data came out. And what came out was that the number of quote unquote minority admissions and minority scholarships paled in comparison with legacy admissions and legacy scholarships. So legacy, for those of you who may know, it has to do with the fact that your father went to Harvard, your mom went to Harvard, your family went to Harvard. So that's this inherited privilege. I have an open door because my parents opened it for me. And we all have that. And I'm not like, use it for good. It would be ignorant to walk through the world thinking that you don't have privilege or that you don't have advantages because of who you know or who your parents are. Everyone has those. What was happening at a school like Harvard is they had a very generous legacy admissions policy. So if your parents went there, your odds of getting in were actually really high. So they looked at that number, and then they looked at the quote unquote minority admissions. And what they found was not only was the number of those admitted because there were minorities smaller, their GPA was higher. So legacy admissions had on average a lower GPA than those quote unquote minority students that were being admitted. So I point out that example, Matt, because I also think there's a perception issue. So you know, in terms of who's deserving and who is not deserving. And that when we pause and we make space and we are intentional about the inclusion of people who have been historically excluded, all we may be doing is making it more fair, not actually providing some great advantages to a certain group. That kind of intentionality and mindfulness may in fact just be making it fair. That proved true for the Ivy League admissions process. The same is true for mortgages. So if you look at redlining, white families had a higher default rate than Black families. So if you were being like, you know, true to the facts and to the statistics, you would be giving loans at a higher rate with at a higher rate, meaning more frequently, at a lower interest rate, which is what's typically done to reward good credit and paying back. That should have been true for Black families over white families when you look at the facts, when you look at the data. But in fact, that didn't happen. So if there is a little bit of repair and recognition and extra help, that's the right thing to do in order to fix the generations and generations of wrong. You know, I think the other mindset that has to be had when having these conversations is having a value of the whole over the individual. Because so long as we hold on to the individual like mattering most, then all we see is ourself. We see ourself in our current year, our current reality, our current frame. It's hard to see behind us. It's hard to see in front of us. But when we look at the whole and we value our impact on the whole, then we can look back and say, it's not actually about me and I need to get out of the way. I can get my ego out of the way. I can step back. I can pass the mic. I can choose to not win in this one situation or gain in this one competition in order for the greater good. In the long run, it does benefit me because I'm a part of the whole. So this oneness mindset, the interconnectedness and interdependent mindset is pretty important actually to understanding both the reality of these situations and to understanding the solutions that would be there. So let's see, inheritance. So okay. Oh, Matt, I see your hand. Let me try to get a few other voices. So then I hear from Janine, do you think that inheritance privilege is just at schools? Oh, is that the legacy? Is that what you mean by that? Or are you talking about inheritance in a money sense? Legacies, okay. I actually don't think it's fair, no. No, I don't. I think it should, you know, I believe in rectifying wrongs. I believe in putting my hand on the scale in order to try to rectify generations of harm. But I think in general, people who have our legacies have such a leg up, have access to so many tutors, have had access to such good education that if they can't get their own good GPA on their own, there's something really wrong. Because I mean, there is so much advantage stacked in that. You know, I mean, you know, my daughter Serena is on this call and I hope she'll forgive me raising this example, but she and I have talked about the fact that, you know, having a tutor is a huge privilege. They're very expensive. It's very hard. And most marginalized kids don't have that. One of Serena's friends was trying to get her to sign up for, and we said no, and Serena agreed, no way, for, what was it, a $6,000 SAT prep course this summer? Look, I'm sorry, but if you've got the money for $6,000 SAT prep course and you've got tutors and all of this and your parents went to Harvard and they can help you at home with your homework, if you can't get that GPA or that SAT score on your own, I don't actually have a lot of sympathy for that. So I'm not a huge legacy fan. I have more sympathy for the fact that you couldn't afford a tutor, that you weren't able to take that $6,000 SAT score, and that because your parents' didn't have a mortgage where they could take out a home equity loan to pay for your parents' education and they weren't able to tutor you in trigonometry at night, that I think does deserve support and extra help. So let's see. Oh yeah, there's the little, and there is a hand thingy that you can click, right? So that would be helpful to me, because I don't want you to have to feel like you have to hold your hand up the whole time. Okay, so Matt, go ahead.
Sorry, going back to the Harvard case, because I actually think it's a very interesting case. I wonder a few things. One, how do you sort of rectify with what you said with, and I could be misremembering these numbers correctly, so if I am, like, feel free to jump in and correct me, but wasn't the rate of admissions actually lower for students of like Asian descent? Didn't they have um, higher scores, like SAT scores and GPAs, and were still admitted at lower rates than other students? So how do you kind of, correct that problem? And the other thing I would wonder is there a difference between a private college and a public college? Obviously, Harvard is trying to make money. I think a large part of the reason why they let in so many legacy students is because, legacy students tend to donate at a higher rate than, first-time students. So would you say that we need to just, some sort of way of, like, getting rid of donations to colleges, or how would you, kind of fix that problem?
An important question. It applies not just to colleges, it applies to politics, right? So we have almost every sphere of our society is poisoned with the fact that money gets you far. Money gets you very far. It gets you influence. So I would agree. I mean, if your question to me is, do I think the influence of money on opportunity and education and policy and law is a problem, I would say yes. It's a huge, huge problem. And there are other countries that I would point to as models for how to do this way better, who have really strong democracies, better, more participatory democracies than we have, and have figured that out. So there are lots of examples, particularly in Northern Europe, particularly among the Scandinavian countries, and others. Then I think to your question about Asians and admissions, you are absolutely right. That was one of the findings as well. And that brings up a different, larger issue, I think, which has to do with the health of community relying on or benefiting from true diversity. And that it's okay for some decisions to be made on the basis of balance and diversity. So for example, I was talking to a friend recently who wanted to work for the UN as a lawyer. And she was really mad because as a white American, she had to compete with like 20,000 applicants, where a lawyer from Rwanda was competing with 5. Okay, so that's the reality. But the UN has made a principled decision that it wanted representative lawyers from all over the world because they believed it would make it a better place. I would support an institution that would say, just because of diversity, this would be a better learning environment if we had lots of balance and lots of people from around the world. I also think it's important to note that the Americans, and I don't know if any of you have lived in Europe or actually Asia as well. This is true for Africa, it's true for Asia, and it's true from Europe. The United States is shockingly individualistic compared to the rest of the world. It's like jolting to people how shockingly individualistic it is. And to the degree to which, so all over Europe, they have quotas and they don't mind. They don't apologize for them. It's completely okay. We're in the United States, it's a bad word. It's considered discrimination, reverse discrimination, all these kinds of things. But just to give you one example, in Norway, there was a law that was passed that said that all corporate boards had to have 40% of them women. This is a quota. And now, did the men feel discriminated against because they were used to having those seats? Yeah, they did. But the government said, I don't care. This is really important. We need balance in corporate government, and we need, women to be a part of corporate government. Just recently, Citibank, all kinds of big banks signed on to a commitment to have 1/3 of all of the managers be women. Will that make some men feel bad because they're used to dominating those positions? Maybe, but they've signed up for it. It's the right thing to do. US labor law doesn't allow that, but they've done this in Europe. In Rwanda, they have a law that women have to make up at least 40% of their legislature. And women are now running that country. Women completely rebuilt that country after their war, and they're an amazing case example of doing well economically, doing well educationally, and having an incredible justice system. And it's run by women for the most part, Rwanda, mainly because that's all that was left after all of the carnage. So there are a lot of examples of that. But again, one has to value the whole over the individual. So let's see if you want to, oh, okay. So I see Supriya, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, no worries. So my question was just about, like, if you think, for example, if you have a case where someone is more qualified over another for a specific position, and with a law like having 40% women as managers or whatever the law may be, do you think that there's some bias kind of with that also kind of determining like who's more qualified for that position? Like, I guess I'm putting this really like badly, but if say you have like a man and a woman like trying to get the same position, say like the man is more qualified in that case for some reason, and there's this law that says that 40% of women should like be in that position, do you think that there's like any favoritism, or I don't want to say favoritism, but like I guess, do you think there's like any bias, I guess, trying to like decide who is more qualified for that position then?
Sure, but there always has been. So just to be clear, I mean, you know, when one applies for a job, for example, you get advantage if you know someone who knows someone who knows someone who can pick up the phone and call and say, hey, can that person get an interview? It's unfair. It's totally unfair advantage. And so this is my point. We have to see all the advantages that are offered by privilege, even as we start to criticize some advantage that might be possible by a policy that says you've got some advantage, right? So it's one has to have their eyes open about the historic advantage that has happened and current advantage that has happened for years and years. There's also, and first of all, and I should say, one should never be in a position that they are unqualified for, because then they would fail, and that's not fair, and that's tokenism. It's kind of saying they're just in this role because they're a woman or from a different ethnic group, and that wouldn't be fair to them. It would set them up for failure, actually. So that is not a part of the equation, but there are plenty of qualified people. But when put neck and neck against somebody else who's had hundreds of years of privilege behind them, may have a harder time competing. I'll give you one example, and we've grappled with this at the Tahirih Justice Center. So we used to look at people's resumes, and one of the things we would look at was their direct experience doing exactly what we do. Sounds like a really important qualification, right? The problem is, in order to do exactly what we do, you have to have parents who can afford unpaid internships for you. Or you have to have enough money to go on, you know, service learning trips, unpaid internships, maybe Peace Corps, things like this. And so by defining qualification as including unpaid internships with nonprofits that look just like us, we were systematically excluding people who may be very smart, very dedicated, and very passionate, but on their resume, because they had to work jobs over the summer, would not have been able to look as qualified. So part of the challenge too is redefining the definition of who's qualified and why. Are we looking really at capacity for learning and the skills that they have, or are we looking at our comfort level with them being in the exact same spaces that we have been in? And so they will easily kind of, you know, form in to those spaces. So that's, you know, we have to look also critically at that. The other is, you know, and I'm very comfortable with this idea of affirmative action because in the Baha'i faith, there's several spiritual principles. For example, we're told that if there isn't enough money to educate a girl and a boy, the girl must have priority. She's the mother of children. She'll be educating generations. Does that disadvantage the guy? Yeah, but hopefully there's enough money for both. I mean, that's the ideal, is that there's enough money for both. Similarly, in the election process, if there's a tie and somebody in the tie is from a minority community, there's no revote. The minority person gets it immediately. So I'm very comfortable with this idea of remedy and the need to prioritize marginalized voices because they have been so systematically oppressed for so long. And then in terms of tokenizing, so, you know, I think something that's very important to say about tokenizing is that it's in the eyes of the beholder. And what I find fascinating is I had a issue just today, actually, where a person of color was the leader on an issue. I got an email from somebody saying, I noticed you had, yeah, that's exactly what she said. I noticed you had a person of color speak on this issue that was tokenizing. The truth was that she volunteered to speak on the issue. The truth is that she's more expert and more qualified than I was. And the truth is she did not feel tokenized. She felt that she had voice. I care more about what she thought than what the person who looking on the outside judging thought. And so I also, and I was having a conversation with this person of color who was the speaker on the issue. And I said to her, you know what, somebody thought I was tokenizing you and I want to bring this up with you because if you felt that way, let me know, you know, we had to have an open conversation about it. It was interesting. She said, I see more white people who are uncomfortable with people of color taking center stage use that phrase as a way to explain why they don't think that's okay. Then I hear people of color use it to describe how they're feeling. So I think we should be careful about using that because it also takes away agency and power. Like, for example, this person who, even the language she used in her email to me, I see that you gave, like I gave her power, which was, the assumption was one of white supremacy. The assumption was that I had all the power and I like benevolently or charitably gave it to her. It was the wrong assumption. She had the power to begin with. It was all her all the time from the beginning, and she is smart and qualified. And it wasn't about me kind of bestowing that on her. So I think I would just encourage caution in using that word freely because it can be unfair in the way it's used, or it can be a way to try to rationalize not having somebody of color be in the forefront. And then I see Vic, you have your hand up, and then I'll go to Janine and then Sebastian and back to Stan. Yes, go ahead, Vic.
I was just thinking that you were talking about like making it more fair for minorities that didn't have the same opportunities as like white people whose parents have gone to those colleges. Like, let's just stick with the idea of colleges. But personally, like as someone whose parents are immigrants from India, and a lot of people I know also like a lot of Asians especially are people whose parents immigrated from less from countries with less opportunities. And even though they came from countries with less opportunities, they managed to do well in America. So from a financial standpoint, it would seem that those Asians who came here are on about the same ground as white people who have had a lot of privilege in this country. And I think it's been a large discussion in my household, especially because my brother's going to college next year, that it seems that Asians are not, even though they are immigrants, and even though their parents were less fortunate, they aren't exactly given like you said, that extra kind of push to make up for the struggles they had before. So do you think that that is a problem, that when you start to include a lot more races that have different roots, that it gets a little more complicated?
Absolutely, it's a great question because it is complicated. right? Not everyone has the same story. Not everyone has the same experience. There is a unique history with slavery in the United States that has a unique multi-generational impact. And similarly, one could say there's a unique experience with migrant workers who've come to the United States, and there's a unique history there, and there are unique laws that have been used against them. So there is, I think every community has unique experiences. The Indigenous community, there's a long list, and it would be an injustice to not mention that. There's another layer too, and I don't know exactly if this is what you were referring to, but it's worth bringing up. And I can see that, I think, Alana brought it up in the comments, that there's a phrase that if you're not already familiar with, you should absolutely be familiar with, which is the model minority concept. And it is the idea that white people are more comfortable with certain people of color and certain minorities than other minorities. And it also has to do with stereotyping. It has to do with movies, and it has to do, with all kinds of things that play into it. But I'll give you one really concrete example. A dear friend of mine who is from southern India, and I don't know, Vic, where your family is from, but she's from southern India. And she was in a car, this is in her teenage years, she's an adult now, but in her car when she was a teenager with an African-American boyfriend. And her family wasn't thrilled about that. There were lots of reasons why she was hiding and being all clandestine. In addition to the fact that they were smoking something that they shouldn't be smoking. So she got caught. The police doing was completely wrong and illegal. But what happened was that the cop came up to her side of the window and said to her, have you ever gotten in trouble before? And she said, no, I haven't. And he said, well, what are your grades like? And she said, I don't know, they're pretty good. She has a lot of pressure from her family. She went to Brown University. She ended up doing really well. He said to her, you're probably going to be my doctor one day, so I'm not going to send you to jail. He then took her boyfriend and handcuffed him and gave him a criminal record for the rest of his life. That's a very stark example, right? But it's truth. It's also truth. And this is what happens to white people all the time too. An example that is embarrassing for me. Oh, and Jada, are we supposed to end at 4? Should I cut this off, or do people want to hang on?
There's discussion, whatever you feel comfortable with.
Okay, well, maybe we can go 10 more minutes. I see at least 10 more minutes of questions, and then we can end. And if people are sitting on urgent questions, I'm happy to stay and just continue to answer, but maybe let's go on as a group for 10 more minutes. Okay, so, and one also horrendous example of privilege that Serena was a part of. Serena and I were driving somewhere. I was driving too fast. It was to get her somewhere on time. And I missed the exit, and I was in the far left lane on the highway and decided to cross over 3 lanes on the highway within a really short, ridiculous, illegal period of time, and went all the way into the emergency lane. And then I backed up on the highway to try to get onto that exit ramp that I had missed. So much wrong about that. And I saw blue lights behind me, and I thought, oh my gosh, here it goes. I deserved it. I did something completely wrong. Police officer comes up to my window. I own it. I'm so sorry, so wrong. I'm trying to get my daughter. She's sitting in the seat next to me, to her thing. And Serena, I'll hide what the thing is for everybody if you want, but it was her hobby. And I said, I'm really sorry, and I was wrong. I did nothing but apologize for it. His answer was, okay, well, just don't do it again. And then he stopped highway traffic. He took his car and he blocked the exit, and he allowed me to back up and then back into the exit ramp, and then waved and told me to have a nice day. I was like, there's so much wrong about that. And I know that would not have happened. It wouldn't have even happened to my husband. He reminds me of that. But certainly if I had had a different background. So this is the kind of privilege that I walk through the world with every day. And so many other people do, and that adds up. It adds up, and it's not a wrong thing to try to correct that. Okay, Janine, you're next.
This is kind of a follow-up question to the one I asked earlier, but you were saying about how having money and then having white privilege and then also having a legacy just gets you more in life. Do you propose any solution to it, or do you see anything in the near future that could be used to help that?
It's a great question. I think some of it has to do with structures in our society to fix that. So, for example, inheritance tax, it used to be taxed under this administration. That's changed. So now people are going to get richer just by who their parents are. I think that's a horrible thing. And it doesn't help the people who inherit the money. There's actually statistics that people who inherit money like that are unhappy, have greater rates of addiction and all kinds of other things. So it's not good for anybody. And so there's structural things that can happen to try to fix that. Also, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, a whole number of other people are a part of a pledge where they pledge to not pass down their money to their kids. There's a very intentional, we're going to give it away and not hoard the money as a family, because it should be given back to society. That's really laudable, and that's really helpful. There are all kinds of other structural things that could happen, the legacy admissions policies, also changing our property tax regime would do a lot. So right now, the good schools are in good neighborhoods with high value properties that pay lots of taxes that go back into the schools, and so on and so on. The only way to fix that is to allow a larger pot, allow money from my school district to go into the money for another school district. So we're not hoarding all of the resources from our property taxes only for our children, but actually allowing benefit. So there are all kinds of structural changes that might happen. There's also something really personal that we can do, and I'm on the journey of this, just like everybody else, is to be intentional about not using your privilege. It's very easy to say, ooh, that came easy, I'll do that, or I'll take advantage of that. And so it's a silly example. It's not profound. It's not going to change the world. But I have repeated privilege with police officers. And, you know, sometimes I don't understand it. But I got pulled over, was it like 6 months ago, I guess. The cop pulled me over and I insisted he give me a ticket. Like, I got real mad. And I was like, no, I'm not actually leaving until you give me a ticket. And he was like, it's okay, I can just give you a warning. And I argued with him and I insisted. I said, this isn't fair. It happens to me too often. I don't deserve it. And I was going over 35, it was a 35 zone. I was going, I don't know, or 25, and I was going 37. He came back and the ticket he gave me said I was going 34 miles an hour. I said, that's not what I was doing. I was going 37 miles an hour. And he said, I know, but if I do 37, it's going to be a $400 fine instead of a $200 fine. And I gave it back. I said, that's not truthful. It's not truthful. And it, you know, anyway, so we can argue our own privilege. Maybe that would help. It's not going to change the world to do that. But I think it's also irresponsible for us to continue to take advantage of things that are handed to us, knowing and seeing visibly that they're not being handed to other people in the same way. Sebastian, you had your hand up. And Janine, I see your hand is still up, but okay, great. So Sebastian, go ahead with your question.
Sure. Thank you. Can you hear me? I don't think my audio is working that well.
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so I just had a relatively specific question I wanted to ask, which is about the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. And so I've heard people who support it and don't support it on both sides of the aisle. And I think it's an interesting piece of legislation that I don't really think I'm entirely sure about, because I've heard so many different arguments about it. But for one thing, obviously, you know, I've heard the argument, which is that, you know, the language of the Constitution, even though there is the there is an interpretation of it now that does that, you know, does away with in general legally, even though it might still happen, you know, workplace discrimination, and otherwise, but that in general, the language of the Constitution using men over and over again, and just in general that there is an explicit protection is sexist. And I've also heard the argument, though, that the ERA would allow for lawyers of men, particularly, to gain an advantage in something like child custody, where, you know, a general advantage is given to the woman in terms of, you know, getting custody of a child in a divorce. So what's your opinion on that? You know, is it necessary? Should we do it? And what would be the implications of it?
So I do hold the view that it's necessary and it would be helpful to have the ERA passed. And I am highly influenced, in my opinion, by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who told me that. So I defer to her on most things, and she understands the law in a way that I don't claim to. But any, even for example, the custody, I mean, really the best legal standard for custody is what's in the best interest of the children. That should be the legal standard. It shouldn't be a preference for women or a preference for men. The ERA would enable more equality in all of those determinations, and is still needed, actually. It is still needed. So it would help, for example, gender-based asylum law, which now has been undone by this administration after 20 years of that legal precedent that I worked on. There are a number of things that would be protected if we had a constitutional amendment clarifying equal rights. It really is mind-blowing to me why we're afraid of it. It's just shocking. And I highly recommend that you all listen to at least pieces of the congressional testimony that took place yesterday on anti-lynching legislation. It's 2020 and we have no anti-lynching legislation in the United States. And similar to me, to the ERA. And you'll hear the same kinds of arguments, but hear through the arguments, hear past what people are saying, because what they're saying is we want the status quo, and we don't really want to be challenged, and we don't really want things to change, and so we want to stay with that old house that I talked about earlier, that kind of old justice system house, because we're too afraid if the architecture changes too much. The ERA would change some fundamental architecture, and I think that's what people are afraid of. So it's now 4:12. I want to be respectful of the fact that people need to go. Matt, the only thing I'll say to your comment is look more at the facts on that, because it's not true. Actually, Baltimore is a distressed area. The tax rate might be high, but the values are very low, and so the money going to the schools is very low. And I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful day.